You would be hard-pressed to find someone today that is unfamiliar with the Looney Tunes. Even though they're nearing 100 years old, they remain as well known today as ever. Thanks to the work of Tex Avery and Fritz Freeling and Chuck Jones and more, and featuring the voice talents of the great Mel Blanc, Looney Tunes produced characters and stories and gags that would be loved for generations. A little-known fact, the name Looney Tunes was a spoof of the Walt Disney series of cartoons called Silly Symphonies. And if you look at each word of both titles, you can see that pretty plainly. Looney instead of silly, and tunes as in music instead of symphonies. And it's actually why tunes is spelled the way it is, when you think it should be spelled Toons, as in cartoons. Now that little nugget of knowledge is neither here nor there. But I tell you all of this because I want to show you a clip this morning from a Looney Tunes short. It's from the 1948 episode called Scaredy Cat, featuring Sylvester the Cat and Porky Pig. We're going to basically see the end of the cartoon, so allow me to catch you up a little bit. Porky Pig is settling down for bedtime, but he's having a rather terrible time getting his cat Sylvester to do the same. He doesn't want Sylvester in his bed, so he continually tries to kick Sylvester out of the room. Anyone with pets at home knows how this feels. But Sylvester the cat is absolutely terrified of mice in Porky's house. Right off the bat, sounds pretty funny. A cat that is deathly afraid of mice. But you quickly see that Sylvester has a good reason to be afraid of these mice. They are actually murderous little things, and they're actively trying to do major harm to Sylvester and Porky. Now, Porky, of course, doesn't believe Sylvester has any good reason. He doesn't believe any of this is happening, so he continually gets frustrated and angry with Sylvester. And this goes on and on through all of the crazy situations that you would expect from a Looney Tunes cartoon. And it finally ends with Porky having enough of Sylvester's antics. So let's pick it up here and see what happens with Porky and Sylvester.
Come on, you scaredy cat. Come on. I tell you, there's nothing in there. Okay. I'm going into that kitchen by myself and prove what a yellow dog of a cowardly cat you really are.
So Sylvester ends up being right, and then he has to overcome his fear and save the day, or save the night, I guess. I showed you this episode because it contains one of those recurring gags that Looney Tunes is well known for, that we see in so many cartoons, because as Sylvester is sitting outside alone, he's suddenly confronted by an angelic figure of himself telling him what he ought to do. And as per usual with this gag, you see a smaller duplicate version of the character in question. In this case, it's Sylvester. Usually they appear on the character's shoulder, whispering in their ear. And it's done that way because it's meant to represent those voices inside our heads that tell us right from wrong. It's a visible representation of what we know as a conscience. I want to talk about this phenomenon of a conscience today. This innate knowing of right and wrong. But I'm not really here to tell you to listen to that angel on your shoulder and to try to do the right thing. I hope that part goes without saying. Instead, I want to talk about the fact that this natural imprint of a moral compass is actually a reflection of God. And if you want to take that a step further, I would say it's our proof of the existence of our Creator. And we're going to end this morning by examining what this means for us as Christians. Let's start off by looking at that fact that us having a moral compass is a very biblical concept. Our Old Testament reading from Jeremiah quotes the Lord telling us that He has put His law in our minds and He has written it on our hearts. It's a beautiful verse, and it's one that's telling us that God has imprinted His law, His covenant on each of us. Romans 1, the first chapter of Romans, verses 18 through 23, it tells us something similar. Let's read those words together. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, His divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. What we know about God, about His nature, about His desire for His creation, we know a lot of that because God has made it plain to us. From the beginning of time, God has made these things seen, so that we know the difference between goodness and godlessness. We know the difference between righteousness and wickedness. We know the difference between light and dark and right and wrong. My favorite theologian, C.S. Lewis, wrote one of my favorite theological books, Mere Christianity. I've mentioned this before. I'm sure I'll mention it again. It was, and it continues to be, a valuable work that I keep coming back to as I learn and reflect more about my own faith. Actually, I kind of had to avoid reading just reading the first 5 chapters to you this morning because it basically deals with the very same thing. But since I didn't want to make this story time with Pastor Adam, and since it would be rather lazy of me to do that, here's the essence of what he says. In the world around us, there are laws of nature that we cannot ignore. There's a law of gravity that we must obey. We can't choose to just start floating or jump 30 feet whenever we want to. There are laws of biology that govern organisms and creatures, and we can't just decide to grow a third eye. But humans have another law, and it's one that's not really present in the rest of nature. We have a law that Lewis calls the moral law. In other words, we know right from wrong. But unlike any of those other laws, we are actually able to choose whether or not we follow this one. We can choose to help someone. We can choose to put ourselves at risk, even, for the good of someone else. If we were only wired with natural laws like we see in the rest of nature, with survival of the fittest, with getting everything we need to make us stronger, this for the greater good notion would not be a part of us. And yet it is. There's something that compels us to do the right thing, and not just for us, but for others. So we have this moral code that's wired into us, that we can choose to follow or not, and that is unique to humans as opposed to any other part of creation. So how do we know that comes from a creator, from God? How do we know that we just didn't develop that on our own? Now, while I said I wasn't going to read you a whole 5 chapters, I didn't really say that I wouldn't sneak in an excerpt. That may have been a little bit sneaky, but my conscience is clear about it. Lewis goes on to talk about the fact that our moral code is strong evidence of a power outside of our universe that has set all of this into motion. He likens it to an architect building a house, but I kind of like to think of it more as a sandcastle. Think of yourself on a beach. Building a sandcastle, you've created this wonderful thing. You have your own personal touches all the way throughout. But you don't actually end up living inside of your sandcastle. You remain outside. Lewis argues that this is how we should expect a creator to act. And then he says our morality is our arrow that points us to the existence of God. He says the only way in which we could expect a creator to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we find inside ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicions. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, that answer turns out to be yes. What it boils down to is this. If there's a creator that exists primarily outside of our universe, wouldn't we expect that creator to give his creation some direction on how he wants it to act? And when we think of that, the answer turns out to be yes. That's exactly what we find. I think it's a fascinating way to look at the universe, arriving at this conclusion that this is all the unmistakable signature of our Creator. It also carries some implications for how we carry out our daily lives. It has implications on how we live because it should affect how we act when we know we've done wrong. It should also affect how we respond when that still small voice tells us what we should be doing. When's the last time that your conscience, as it were, told you that you needed to do something you didn't really feel like doing, maybe even didn't want to do? Did you grumble? Did you put it off? Did you maybe even ignore it and just hope it would go away? How would that have changed if you had thought in that moment that what you were feeling was the direct result of God's imprint on your life? I think it would at least give me pause if I would start to drag my feet and maybe complain when it's time to do the right thing. I think it should give us joy even to do the right thing when the Holy Spirit starts stirring us into action. When you think of the fact that we have been set apart from the rest of creation to have this moral compass, when you think of this indelible mark that our Creator has placed on us, and then all of a sudden, it seems that doing the right thing isn't so much of a burden. It may not be that we have an angel on our shoulder. We might not have that miniature version of ourselves that pops up during a tough time or a difficult situation and whispers in our ear what we need to do. Personally, I don't know about you, but I don't really need a mini-me popping in and out like that. I hardly think that you would want that either. But what we do get, I think, is so much more meaningful. We have been marked by our Creator to know what He desires of us. He has given us the Holy Spirit as our guide. He set us into communities of faith that help us discern when we aren't sure what we need to be doing. And what all of this amounts to, our conscience, our moral code, all of it, is really a God that has set us apart. It amounts to a God that has written His law on our hearts. And all of God's people said,